Sometimes the only parent you'll ever truly have is the one that you will become. So if you've wondered why you struggle with boundaries, self trust, or feeling safe in your own skin, this episode is going to show you why and how to start healing by not making some common mistakes during the reparenting process. Now, just to be clear, if this is reparenting is new to you, it's to me it reminds me of self-healing, but it is a process of giving yourself the emotional nurturing, boundaries, validation, and care you may not have consistently received during childhood. But at its core, reparenting isn't about blaming, it's about reclaiming. Because you can't change your past, but you can give yourself the kind of relationship that heals it. And the first mistake during this process to avoid is trying to be perfect. If this sounds familiar, this belief that healing should be linear, clean, and mistake free is one of the biggest blocks to true reparenting. And here is why it's so dangerous, because it turns your healing journey into another performance, another standard you got to live up to, another way to say to yourself, if I mess up, I must not be doing this right. So, if you grew up in a home where love was conditional on your behavior, your grades, your silence, your perfection, then of course your brain wired itself to believe that you must get it right to be safe, that mistakes equal punishment, and that imperfection equals unlovable. Here's how this perfectionist healing, so if you're making this mistake, is going to show up in your everyday life. The first thing, you try to do healing right. So you're following every method, inner child letters, meditations, journaling. But the moment you don't feel better instantly, you think it's not working. The second thing, the second way it shows up, you hold impossible standards. You expect yourself to never react, never get triggered, never spiral, when in reality, the brain doesn't rewire itself overnight. The nervous system doesn't transform in silence, it transforms in safety, and safety comes from compassion. The third way it shows up, you punish yourself for slipping. Maybe you ghost your therapist for 2 weeks or binge watch TV instead of doing your nightly routine. Then comes the guilt, right? The shame spiral, the what's wrong with me spiral. But here's what's actually true: you're human, you're healing, and healing is not a test you pass, it's a relationship you build. So let me challenge this limiting belief that if you mess up, you're failing at healing. Let's flip that. Let's say this out loud. Say it out loud. If I mess up and stay present with myself, I'm practicing healing. If I mess up and choose self compassion, I'm deepening my reparenting. Every time you fall and stay with yourself, that's reparenting. And so real reparenting looks a little like this. I'm going to give you some real world reparenting in action moments. So let's say you have a panic attack, and instead of shaming yourself, you say, it's okay, you're safe, I've got you. Or you binge eat after a hard day, and instead of starting a crash diet the next morning, you get curious about what you really needed. But we're going to move forward into another sneaky way that blocks you from reparenting appropriately. And that's trying to heal yourself with the same tools that actually hurt you. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about something that most people don't realize that they're doing until they're deep into burnout and wondering why healing still feels like self abandonment. So, if you're trying to heal yourself with the same mindset, the same methods, and internal voices that hurt you in the first place, it's not going to work. You're trying to parent your inner child using the same shame-based, push through, prove yourself approach that made you feel unsafe to begin with, and it's keeping you stuck. Let's break this down on why we actually do this from a psychological lens. As children, Our nervous systems absorb more than just words. Let me say that again because it's so powerful. As children, our nervous systems absorb more than just words. They absorb tone, energy, and expectation. If you grew up in a household where love was tied to performance, where emotions were met with irritation or silence or punishment, where working hard was celebrated but needing rest was shameful, then guess what? Your inner parent, the one you're trying to become, was shaped by those models. So even when you decide to reparent yourself, you might unknowingly default to forcing yourself to meditate every day, or else you feel like a failure, journaling from a place of self judgment, not curiosity or healing, practicing self care, but only after you've earned it. That is not reparenting. That's repackaged perfectionism. So imagine this. Here you are, you're an exhausted coach and you're trying to help your team. But the only tools you have are a whistle, a stopwatch, and a clipboard full of rules. No water, no snacks, no compassion, just try harder, run faster. You're trying to coach a tired team with the same system that made them tired in the first place because they don't get any breaks, no rest, no water, no energy in the form of snacks. This is what happens when you try to heal from wounds with the energy of your wounding. You're not being too hard on yourself because you're bad at healing. You're being too hard on yourself because you learned love had to be earned. And now you're trying to earn your own healing. So I want to challenge that limiting belief that if you just push harder, you'll finally feel better. Let's just call it what it is: survival mode disguised as personal growth. You've been taught to perform for validation. So when you step into healing, you think you have to perform healing the same way. You're not resting, you're checking off boxes. You're not soothing, you're correcting. You're not reparenting, you're policing. And this shows up in real life, not just if you were sitting journaling or doing affirmations. So let's get specific in how this actually plays out. And the first example I can talk to you about is self-talk. Self-talk that sounds nice but feels not so much, because you say things like, I should know better. Come on, we're better than this. Let's get it together. Underneath that self talk that may sound like it's positive is fear, pressure, conditional acceptance, right? The second way is performing inner child work without feeling it, because there's a difference. So maybe you sit down, got your journal out, you're writing to your inner child, but it's robotic. You're skipping the feelings. You rush to the part where you say, I love you, but you don't actually feel that. It's not because you're broken, it's because the voice you're using might not actually be safe yet. And another way, the third way I can tell you that it shows up is you punish yourself when you regress. For example, you ate the thing, you texted the ex, you skipped your routine. And your first instinct, tighten up, crack down, get stricter. That's the old voice, the one that thinks shame is the path to redemption. And there are reasons why this just simply isn't going to work, because your nervous system doesn't respond to pressure, it responds to presence. Healing doesn't happen in hustle, it happens in safety, in gentleness, in rest. You can't learn to trust yourself while being bullied by yourself, because ultimately that's what you're doing. So, how do you shift it? What's the shift? Reparenting isn't about applying more pressure to be better than. It's about unlearning the idea that pressure is love. If you want to heal, you have to learn a new language, one that speaks in tenderness, not toughness. So instead of you messed up again, try, well, that makes sense. You were scared. Instead of you're being lazy, try you're tired. Let's rest with kindness. Instead of you always do this, try this pattern used to protect you, but we're safe now. This is the new voice. This is the real parenting voice. And no, this is not giving yourself excuses. You are reparenting yourself. In order to do that, you have to change the voice. You have to give yourself a new voice. And I want to ask you to take the time and ask yourself so that you can really help yourself with this new voice. Ask yourself, am I trying to heal myself with the same energy that hurt me? And what would it feel like to speak to myself the way I needed to be spoken to, not the way I was? Now, write that down. Sit with it. Let that be your practice today. Because we're going to move into another mistake that we're going to talk about, something that almost all of us avoid, and that is called grief. That is the third mistake. You skip grief and you go straight to positive vibes. Because if you focus on the pain, then you might be considered dramatic. Let me say something that might go against then the whole good vibes culture. You cannot reparent yourself without grieving what you didn't get. Let me restate that again. It's so important. It is so powerful. You cannot reparent yourself without grieving what you didn't get. So you can't skip the sadness. You can't bypass the longing. You can't slap affirmations on top of abandonment and call it healing. It's not going to work. Yet, that is what many people try to do, not because they're shallow or inauthentic, but because grief, it's scary. And most of us were never taught how to hold it. So we avoid it. Grief feels like a threat to the nervous system, especially if your emotional needs were dismissed as a child. So if you were told, for example, as a child, you're too sensitive, stop crying before I give you something to cry about, that's in the past, let it go, then your nervous system has learned something. It's learned that grief is dangerous, feeling means weakness, pain is a problem to fix, not a wound to heal. So now, as an adult, when the grief surfaces, whether it's over a childhood need that was never met, or a parent who wasn't emotionally available, or a memory that hurts more than you expected, your instinct is to focus on the good, stay strong, rise above it. But here's the thing, you can't rise above what you haven't sat with. So come along with me, and I want you to imagine you're trying to build a beautiful new home, but the land underneath is full of broken bricks and rotting wood from an old structure. You want to move forward, you want to build something strong, but unless you clear out that foundation, every new piece you build on top of that is going to wobble. This is what happens when we try to build joy without acknowledging pain. You cannot layer peace on top of grief and expect it to hold. And so, grief in this context, when we look at it in reparenting, it isn't about death, it's about grieving the mother who couldn't see you, grieving the father who never protected you, grieving the emotional safety you never knew, grieving the parts of yourself you had to hide to survive. And here's a truth, you don't need to justify your grief with trauma headlines. You don't need your pain to be bad enough to deserve mourning. Loss is loss, and unmet needs are a kind of loss. And now I want to challenge that limiting belief. If I feel the pain, I'll fall apart. This belief is way too common and yet so very understandable. We're afraid that if we finally let the sadness in, it will just swallow us up. Here's the truth, grief is just a visitor. It comes to be felt, not to destroy. And it moves like a wave, like any emotion, fleeting emotion. And every time you meet it with gentleness instead of resistance, It's going to pass with a little more ease. And on the other side, you're not going to be broke down and have breakdown. You're going to have a breakthrough. And I think it's important that I give you some real life examples of how this reparenting through grief may show up for you. So let's say you're journaling, and during journaling, you suddenly feel a lump in your throat. Your instinct is to probably skip past it, but instead, you should pause and write, I miss the safety I never had. Another example of how it may show up in real life is you hear someone say, I'm proud of you. And tears actually begin to well up. Like it makes you feel that, not because they said it, but because someone else never did. Or you walk into a room and you feel invisible. And instead of brushing it off, you say, little me is aching to be seen right now. That moment of recognition, that's grief. That's the healing. That's the doorway. Because reparenting means holding space for the sadness. And one of the most powerful things you can do as a reparenting adult is this: when the child in you cries, you don't rush to fix it. You don't silence it with toxic positivity. You sit, you witness, you say, you're allowed to feel that, and I won't leave you. You can actually visualize your adult self sitting with yourself as a child, because maybe no one ever sat with you, or maybe no one ever said that to you, but now you can say it to yourself. And there is a truth in this, a truth that grief is not the opposite of healing, it's the portal to it. We live in a culture that is obsessed with getting over it. Get over this, get over that, do better, be better. But what if the goal isn't to get over it, but to finally just be with it? Reparenting is about holding both, the part of you that still aches and the part of you that can hold that ache with grace. This is how you build safety within. This is how you rewrite your nervous system story, not through good vibes only, but through honest, compassionate presence. And so I want you to ask yourself, what pain are you trying to skip in the name of positivity? And what would it feel like to sit with that pain instead of running from it? Maybe you'll write a letter to your inner child that starts with something like this: I'm sorry no one let you grieve. I'm here now. You can cry, and I'll sit with you and I'll stay. And let's just use that powerful reflective space to move into another belief that keeps people stuck in healing limbo, that you have to do all of this work by yourself in isolation. And that's the fourth mistake, that you need to heal in isolation, that if you just do enough inner work, you don't need anyone. Let me ask you something. Have you ever said to yourself, I don't need help, I've got this, I'll figure it out on my own? No one's ever shown up for me anyway, so why would I expect that now? If so, you're not alone. In fact, you're in good company, because this belief is incredibly common for people who've grown up feeling emotionally unsafe, unseen, or unsupported. And that truth, that really in it on its own brings us to the fourth reparenting mistake. Let's just break it down. If your childhood environment taught you that vulnerability was dangerous, that you had to be the strong one, that your feelings were too much or nobody cared, then guess what? Your nervous system equates self-reliance with survival. You learn to shut down, figure it out, push through, and not depend on anyone, because depending on others meant disappointment or punishment or neglect. So now, as an adult, even in your healing, you're still trying to just do it alone. But I got some, I got some truth for you. You learn to self abandon in the name of independence, and healing won't come from repeating that. Let me say that again, because it's so powerful. If you're doing this, you learn to self-abandon in the name of independence, and healing won't come from repeating that. Let me challenge that limiting the belief that if you need help, you must be weak. Let's call it out for what it is: a survival belief, a trauma response, not a truth. We live in a culture that glamorizes independence, especially emotional independence. But real strength, it's not pretending you don't have needs. It's learning how to get those needs met in healthy, aligned, and safe ways, because healing is not, it was never meant to be heroic. It was meant just to be held. So come along with me and imagine that you're locked in a house. You don't have the key. You're in there. And you've convinced yourself that asking someone outside for help would just be a weakness. You don't want to be embarrassed. Whatever you've convinced yourself of, it would just be a weakness. So you walk the hallways, you push every door, you try every window, and years go by until one day someone walks up to the window and says, "Hey," they look in, they can see you. "I have the key. Want me to show you where the lock is?" Now pause right there. Most people wouldn't even say yes. It's hard to believe, but they wouldn't. They'd say, "I should have found it myself," or "I don't want to owe anyone." But here's the point of the story: you were never meant to stay locked in your own pain. Sometimes the key to your next chapter is in someone else's hands, not because you're broken, but because you're human. And there is science. There, of course, is always science, isn't there? But there is evidence that backs up why healing in a community works. Your nervous system is actually wired for co regulation. So, this simply means that healing isn't just internal, it's relational. When you're in a safe space with someone who holds presence for your pain without judgment, and that's important, your nervous system learns a new rhythm. It recalibrates from hypervigilance to rest, from self defense to trust, from "I have to do this alone" to "I'm safe to be seen." That's not just emotional, it's actually it's biological. And there are some real life signs that, if you want to know if you're healing in isolation, let's make it real for you and how it shows up in your life. So, for example, you're feeling overwhelmed, but you don't reach out for help. You just get busy or go silent. You downplay your struggles, even in healing spaces. You feel like no one could possibly understand your story, so why bother trying to explain it? And you think, if I share this, I'm just going to burden someone. But ask yourself this: would I ever say that to a child who came to me needing support? Would I tell them to figure it out alone? Of course not. So, why do we say it to ourselves? The truth is, you weren't meant to do this alone. Healing can begin in solitude, but it deepens in relationship. You need people who see you when you can't see yourself. You need voices that speak softness into your inner chaos. You need community, mentorship, and presence. I want you to do something for me to really understand, to further be able to assimilate how working with someone, having a community, having someone you feel safe with can help really deepen your healing. So ask yourself, where have I been trying to prove I don't need anyone? And then ask yourself, what might shift if I allowed myself to be supported? And write this down. What I never got from others, I can now give myself with others. And this brings us to our final reparenting mistake. And I've saved the biggest one for last because, trust me, it's a big one. Because even after all the insight, the journaling, the intention, you're still stuck. Why? Because you don't have a framework, a container, a process to follow. So let's talk about Mistake 5. You you don't have a framework. You just have hope. So let's talk about this mistake. If I keep trying random tools, eventually it'll click because you don't have a framework, you just have hope. So you've been doing the work, you've been doing the work. You've read the books, you've watched the videos, you filled the journal with daily entries. You've lit the candles, you've heard the podcast, maybe even cried during a meditation. It's true, you're trying, you're healing, you're showing up, you're doing all of that. But still, you feel stuck. Why? Well, I would answer this by saying that you don't have a system, you don't have a structure, you don't have a clear guided step-by-step path. And that is a big one for the fifth reparenting mistake. Basically, you're thinking hope alone is enough to carry you through healing. And okay, hope is powerful, but it's incomplete. And don't get me wrong, hope is also beautiful. It's what got you here. It's what kept you alive during the hardest chapters. It's what made you say, maybe there's something more for me. But hope without a framework, it's like having bricks with no blueprint. You end up building and rebuilding the same emotional walls over and over without knowing why they keep collapsing. So come along with me as so I can make this make sense of what this looks like. Because imagine you're trying to build a bridge across a river. So you have all the materials, you have the wood, the rope, the nails, even the tools, but you have no plan, no steps, no support. So you start, you lay a few planks down, you step onto them, but they wobble and you're panicking, obviously. And then you just kind of retreat from it. Next time you try a different method, then another, then another. And eventually you tell yourself, because none of these methods are working. So eventually you just, you tell yourself, maybe I'm not just meant to cross over this river, but that's not true. The problem isn't you either. The problem's this: you've never been shown how. And this is why we keep trying these things without real deep change. So if you grew up in chaos, changes are your nervous system craves structure, but it also fears it. You were taught to self direct, self soothe, self manage, and self heal. Now, even in your healing, you're resisting frameworks. And you'll say stuff like this: I'll take what works and leave the rest. I don't need a formula. I just need to feel it out. But here's what happens: you patch together bits and pieces from different philosophies, you stitch together content from strangers, you try to lead yourself through the dark with a borrowed flashlight, and then you're wondering why nothing sticks. So, let's challenge that limiting belief that I should be able to figure this out by now. Let's flip it. You shouldn't have to figure this out alone. And you were never meant to heal without support, safety, and strategy. What you really need is a healing framework that holds you. Reparenting is more than a mood, it's a process. So you're going to need clarity. Where are you in your journey and what's next? You need tools. What do you do when you spiral? You're going to need integration. How do you turn knowledge into practice? You're going to need support. Who can hold space when you can't hold space for yourself? And this is where transformation really begins, not in consuming more content, but in committing to a container where the content becomes your life. And now I'd like to give you a couple more really deep reflection points that will help you understand the importance of having community and not doing everything on your own. So I want you to ask yourself, what would change if you had a guide for this part of your journey? And then ask yourself where you are holding hope when what you really need is help. So if you've been walking through life feeling like something's missing, if you've been trying to do the work but still carry the ache, if you're tired of cycling through the same patterns, the same inner battles, Let this be your turning point. Reparenting isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about finally giving yourself the love, safety, and structure you were always worthy of. You are not too late, you are not too much, and you are absolutely not alone in this. This is your invitation to stop just surviving and start healing with direction, support, and a plan that actually sticks. If this spoke to you in any way, I would love for you to subscribe to the podcast, to click the like button, leave me feedback. You can find me anywhere where you get your podcast. Let's walk this together step by step. Thank you for joining me on this episode today on Speaking of This. And remember, I'm sharing this for educational and personal growth purposes. This isn't therapy and it's not a substitute for professional mental health support. Until next time, take care of your mind, body, and soul.